I think at this point we'll just leave it open to questions. I'm happy to. I'm sure there'll be plenty of them, and maybe let's start at the very back.
I come here not knowing who organized the evening or what's the ostensible purpose of the evening, so I'd appreciate some response to those two questions.
Well, that would put me on the spot, I guess, not our speakers, right? This actually began through a discussion that I was having with, I guess, a Victoria municipal activist, Ray Zimmerman, I guess a Greater Victoria municipal activist or regional activist, and we were simply talking about the fact that what we normally see with regard to information about amalgamation tends to be pro-amalgamation. And certainly from my perspective, I don't want to speak for Ray, but from my perspective, I simply haven't seen enough to make up my mind one way or the other. And definitely I think the level of attention is, the dynamic seems to be towards making some decision fairly soon. And so given that I have the opportunity to teach at Camosun College, I thought this would be a good venue to have a forum of this kind with some speakers who are offering a perspective that I hadn't heard before. And I don't know, Ray, did you want to add anything?
Yes, and it was very simple. There was no organization involved. It was simply, I phoned Robert Bish in Florida and asked to speak to him when he was back up here, and we met, and I asked him if he would speak publicly, and he said yes. And it's not often that you get that kind of expertise. Yeah. Jonny Carline, I heard a presentation in Metchosin and asked him if he would speak publicly for him, and he said yes. So it was, the reason we're here is because these two gentlemen are generous with their time and willing to speak. And that's it.
Yes, please.
And Ray had called me about some issues of subdivisions in the timberlands out in the western communities, because I used to do a lot of work on shoreline management and planning and zoning, which had nothing to do with this. We just visited more, and then he suggested we see. So it's a pure accident. And seeing I live here 3 months in the summer and enjoy visiting with my friends after having taught here 20 years, it's fine to come this evening and visit with people.
Can I just add one thing as well? Myself, I've been reaching out to Bob through email in Florida to ask questions because I wanted to learn, and he is incredibly generous. I would get these responses like this. And he sent me an email and said he had been invited to a forum, and so I emailed Larry and said I would be happy to do some shameless media on behalf of he and Ray, if that would be of help. And so that's been my small involvement.
Just one other quick point, and that's why it was so interesting to see how many councillors were here. I did take the trouble to go to every municipality and write out the name of a councillor and the name of the mayor, and left that at every municipality. So it's really nice to see some of the councillors. I don't know if that's why they came or not, but anyway, everybody had an invitation.
Okay, so we'll go to the question just right down here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Go ahead.
for organizing this forum. I think it was very interesting, and I gained a lot from your experience. Now, the question I have for Dr. Robert Bish, it seems to me that you were making a case of the central city, some sort of amalgamation of the core municipal government. And the question I have, Saanich has two different cultures, rural area and the urbanized area. And I just wonder, do you have some thoughts on
No, the central city here, in spite of Saanich being bigger, is really Victoria.
The urban and non-urban.
And there's a long history of central cities accumulating the problems, and the suburb, and people leaving the central city to escape the problems. And so, at one time, all welfare was local. You can't run welfare locally when the wealthier people are out in the suburbs and the poor people are left in the older housing of the central city. So we just use it as a term, and I use it to refer to Victoria because, I mean, we have other areas that are as old. We have parts of Esquimalt and so on, but it seems to be accumulating more of the problems. And that's just the way urban areas grow.
So you're not making a case of Central City,
No.
some form of...
No, I think the problem, you know, when British Columbia took welfare to the provincial level, that was extremely important. It's just like taking school financing to the provincial level. There are certain things need to be done on a larger scale, or you get distortions locally. One you can understand, the city of Tacoma runs at its cost a great school for deaf children. I have friends with deaf children who live in Tacoma and commute to their jobs in California every week, because that's a free service that would cost a lot of money somewhere else. And for some reason, Tacoma's got a lot of deaf kids relative to the size of the population. Okay? Well, you know, when we had housing programs, and I used to work on housing back in the 1960s, we had housing programs at the local level that attracted people that needed subsidized housing. There's some of these things, people are smart. You know, people in the Maritimes, if you go to the provincial level, understand seasonal unemployment comp. You know, at the local level, this can really be distorting, and you can end up with very unfair burdens on some areas compared to others. And in the US, with the big counties in the West, that was an intermediate solution that solved a lot of these. But we didn't have those. Our regional districts are voluntary. We do not expect the regional districts on their own to absorb a lot of voluntary income redistribution type services.
So do you have any solution for Victoria, for example?
No, I think the questions Jonny has raised, we've been grappling with these questions among friends of mine. I've suggested, why don't we at least elect the executive officer of the regional district at large. I'd never thought about the second, using the functional model. I don't know where you've been, because that's what the fascists did, you know. but I mean, we know we have a problem. In other words, the regional district has been incredibly successful at getting cooperation on things, especially here in the capital region, where most of them are sub-regional. We don't have many regional. Over in Vancouver, virtually all their activities are regional. Here they're mostly sub-regional. But we know we have a problem that we haven't solved on the regional scale that Jonny described. And the question is, how do you organize that in a way that doesn't start them fighting? Because you talked about the different communities. As an economist, I look at that differently. If you look at an activity like Parks and Rec or police or fire, any activity, some of the activities within it need to be done locally and some need to be done regionally. And so you can't divide up the functions like Ontario tried to do, because you're going to start fighting over the things that should have been given to the other level because you gave whole functions rather than activities within functions. It's like Montreal ending up with fire protection at the top level, and half the time the people in the fire stations don't know the neighborhood they're working in. You know, that needed to be local. Yes, arson investigation, a whole bunch of things need to be, but you got to divide them up, and we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to combine what we have with the strong regionalism that's needed for some of these issues.
Let's move down to the front here.
Quick question, I hope. I'm new to Victoria. I'm back after 12 years in Ottawa, and we saw that everything rose to the same high level of services and expense over that 12-year period. And I think they had a surprise of a $40 million deficit this year. So you articulated that concisely, but I felt it for over a decade. My question is the boards. I sit on a couple of boards, and the last thing you want on a board is all the tools in your toolkit, the same type of, I don't know, screwdriver. What you want is a diverse toolkit. You describe a situation at the CRD where all the people going to the CRD of different personalities are functionally quite similar in their background. They've all got elected as
Yeah, well,
councillors.
yeah, that part's similar.
A few from the Squamos. But you talked about appointments of boards or direct elections of boards. That sounds like not necessarily the whole board, but adding to the board mix. Like,
What Johnny described, I mean, I ran the idea of elected head of the board and so on by some people who didn't like it, but that doesn't solve the problem.
But what is your question?
The question is, what would it take in terms of a legislative experiment to try it differently? Some boards, in some things, the board director gets to appoint a few other board members in order to add to the mix to cover up for defects or, somebody who takes a larger scale as opposed to a sub-regional representation. But what would it take in governance to try those small experiments to see if you can make the current system work better as opposed to a forced amalgamation from above?
Okay.
I frankly think the ministry staff would be interested in that. I don't know the minister. You got a new deputy minister, but I know a lot of the staff, and I think they would be interested in. They recognize the problem. This is not an unknown problem. They like the regional district model as far as it's gone, because it's voluntary, and we've got a lot more cooperation than places where it's not been voluntary. But everybody recognizes the problem. I think they're very open to creative solutions. I never know the politics because parliamentary systems can depend upon the personality of the minister in a way that south of the border they don't. But I wouldn't rule out something like that at all.
Johnny, thoughts on that? What is it going to take?
What was it going to take? A small miracle. To start with, basically municipalities, mayors and councils are intensely conservative about change. The current situation basically leaves them in the catbird seat in terms of their own municipalities. And basically, as Bob said, the regional system is voluntary, and therefore if it gets a little squishy, then you kind of just back off from the region making really strong decisions. The model of having a function-based representative on a board basically comes from odd entities like the Airport Authority in Vancouver. And when that was created, I looked at it. I was involved, I was the city manager of Richmond at the time, and so had to represent Richmond in those discussions. And I looked at it, I thought, my God, this is the most unaccountable system I've ever seen in my life. It couldn't possibly work. It was completely, and they had some geographical entities like Richmond would appoint someone to the board, but they also asked lawyers and accountants, the people they thought, engineers, the Engineering Association of BC and all the rest of it, to appoint someone to the board. So they had a mixture of people who are representing, if you like, a constituency like we know them, a geographical constituency, but some people who also brought to it just the expertise and perspective of that. And to my amazement, it worked. Partly because the chair and the original CAO were absolutely committed to fantastic communication and sensitivity to the local areas that they were going to be affected. And they put a lot of, and I was really surprised about that because neither of them were known to be, kind of soft citizen type of people, but they just had their heads screwed on, but it worked. Now, how you would get that about, obviously it would take radical legislation, even on a temporary basis to do it. My experience is you won't get that leadership coming out of the local government, and I don't think you'll get the leadership coming out of the province because it's a lose-lose for them. They just, any tinkering with it, and you've got God knows how many municipalities, influential political leaders throwing bricks at you. So they play it real safe.
So who would appoint this expertise?
I think we'll go up to the back. Take another question still. Yeah,
I just want to provide some information that I think is relative to the topic, and maybe disclose the law was my predecessor, and Johnny was my my colleague for 30 years. So I don't find anything provocative. I actually agree with everything that Tim said. But I did work for, everyone should know that there were 4 municipalities forcibly amalgamated in BC in 1975. And I was the city manager in one of them for 20 years. And the flip side of all services rising to the top and everybody going to the highest collective agreement is that it can't be done. So I can tell you in Nanaimo, 40 years later, they still have not met the promised expectation of bringing all services up to the same level because it can't be done. They can't afford it. So there are some BC examples that I provide to you in terms of previous amalgamations that the local politicians won't tell you haven't worked, but they have problems.
At the front here.
I want to follow up from this similar question. On our honeymoon over the summer, we went to a couple council meetings on the East Coast, and they've got word systems in place, which is also similar sort of an interesting perspective. And so with a ward system, of course, you're elected for your particular neighborhood as opposed to the city at large, and again, we're sort of dealing with the same sort of situation. For both that type of a system and also for the regional system, is it a provincial legislation that has to change that, or is that something that can be adopted at the local, at the CRD level or at the municipal level? It is like the provincial legislation doesn't allow for a structure change?
That's kind of an interesting question because we've had First Nation members sitting on regional district committees for a very long time without any particular authorizing legislation that I know of, other than you're allowed to contract. We've contract with a First Nation on services was in the legislation. And they paid their bills. You know, they were assessed just like the municipalities. But I have no idea, I guess because no one ever challenged them. But it is provincial legislation. BC is, again, an outlier in Canada. It gives its municipalities more independence than any other province in Canada. Sometimes, frankly, in ways I think are bad. You know, anybody familiar with my work would realize that I don't think you should have unlimited variable tax rates when a quartile of your municipalities have the highest industrial tax rates in all of North America. And then you wonder why anybody won't do heavy industry here unless it's to get a natural resource out. Well, of course they're not. You know, you got property taxes that are equivalent to 50 or 60% income taxes on a new investment in a plant. Okay, I think there may be limits. Maybe the province should wake up and maybe not let UBCM have its way on everything.
Johnny.
Just a quick word. When I first started my Canadian career, I was in Toronto and they had a ward system there. So just a couple of observations there in terms of you had a ward system and a Toronto City Council and then a Metro Toronto board. And the interesting thing about this old city of Toronto, they used to elect 2 ward members, and to have a rule as to who should go to the regional district, they said the top of the poll goes to the region as well as the city council, and the second in the poll just gets to serve as a ward council on the local city council. The interesting thing was the people who ran, who might have been really useful at the regional level, the policy wonks, the intellectuals, the best they ever did was second. And the guys who are really good at looking after those local issues, you know, the distribution, the pick up of the trash and the cleaning of the streets and all the rest of it, they always top the poll. So they always finished going to the regional board where they made absolutely zero contribution. And the intellectuals sat on the ward issues, you know, looking after who picked up the trash, you know. Didn't work. But it's interesting when it came to the city making decisions, if it was a city-wide kind of policy decision, they all participated. But if it was just a pure local ward issue, they'd look to the 2 ward aldermen and very rarely overrule them. The 2 ward aldermen got to say what happened in their local ward.
You know, Johnny, there is a very important thing that I'm not sure Canadians understand. We have the weak mayor system here.
Yes.
which means, the mayor, except for setting the agenda and wearing a bunch of metal around his neck, is no different than anybody else. Virtually all larger American cities have an executive, a strong mayor that's elected at large, and that's where the budget gets put together. It's in the executive department. And then you're dealing with them like a legislature. And yes, so some local things get left up to the ward boss, but there is someone there that pays attention to the whole city. And not only do they pay attention, because our mayors pay attention, they have clout. And maybe we have situations where we need to elect the top executive that has some clout, rather than have another chairman who's appointed who basically, they can set the agenda. I mean, there are lots of things around the world that are different than in Canada. We do a very good job on cooperating voluntarily on a regional level, believe me. We really do. But then that leaves some things that are not solved.
Right. Marion, I think you had a question. Go ahead.
Oh, I was visiting in the Toronto area in the late 1990s when the referendum took place, and Jane Jacobs and others communicated so well the concept of Toronto as a city of neighborhoods that I think that's why the referendum was opposed to amalgamation. But then the government of Ontario decided that they would amalgamate Toronto despite that. And I'm wondering if you could give examples of cities that have de-amalgamated and how it was done.
We had 14 in Montreal.
Yes.
And the reason the vote was rigged against de-amalgamating, because it was 60% of the voters list, and those voters lists hadn't been updated literally forever. And 14 still voted to de-amalgamate. But it was a situation where the PQ forced the amalgamation. And the Anglo and a few of the French went to the Liberals and said, we'll vote for you in the next election if you let us de-amalgamate. And the PQ got kicked out of office, and the Liberals came in, and they didn't want to do it. There's no question about it. They were hesitant, but they finally allowed the vote, and 14 de-amalgamated. Now, there's reason to believe that the leftover of the way they reassign some things probably only leaves them a couple $100 million a year more in local government costs than before they started the whole mess. So it's been a disaster.
I just want to chip in with the background on the Toronto situation, because there's an amusing story about that. They'd gone through this what I call the disentanglement process, and so they had the local cities, and then they had the regional governments largely directly elected, and they hoped that would solve the problem, and it didn't. And the mayor of the small city of Toronto phoned the premier and said, "This isn't working. We're fighting all the time. Local level versus regional level. Nothing's getting done. You've got to get rid of one of these tiers of government." And clearly what she intended was for him to get rid of the regional level. He spent some time, looked at it, he actually did look into it, and then he phoned it back, according to my sources, and the conversation went something like this. I've looked into that problem. You have convinced me that one of the tiers have got to go, and I've looked into the problem. I've looked at the upper tier and looked at how it could perform lower tier functions, and I think it would do it very badly, worse than the local municipalities. But I've looked at the lower tier and see whether they could do the upper tier functions. And clearly no municipality can provide regional water or regional sewer or regional transportation. Just couldn't happen. So you're going to have the upper tier service. But you've convinced me that one of the tiers should go, and you're it. And so I ended a political career.
There was a question down here. Yeah. Yes, sir.
My name is Earl Anthony, and I'm the secretary to the Board of Amalgamation, yes. And I want to congratulate both of you on your presentation. Matter of fact, when you were finished with your presentation, I was going to come and talk to you about sitting on the board. All the questions you've raised are the questions that are driving us nuts. And so this is why, one of the reasons we initiated this conversation to try to get this amalgamation issue, or the local government issue, on the way. And one of the issues we looked at, Dr. Bish, is your commitment to the idea that little is less expensive than big. And I'd just like
No,
to
just let me say that. For some activities, I'm an economist. You got to look at activities.
you recognize the table. I'm sorry I don't have copies.
No, it won't help most people in the audience, right? So,
We know if it is getting.
No, no.
Let me just finish. You'll recognize the table, Dr. Bish. It's very similar to the one you had in your 1991. It lays out the total expenditures by each municipality in the 13 and divided by their population to get the cost per citizen
capita.
to pay. And that was in your document.
Right.
So this is 1913 or 2013 numbers. So if you look at that, you'll see that it ranges. Each of the municipalities is different, but across the bottom, the average payment is $880 per capita for this region. Now we looked out, is there a region in the province, is there a municipality in the province that's as big as the capital region that we could compare this to? So we looked around at all the other municipalities in the region, in the province, and we found that Surrey was exactly the same size as the capital region. It has exactly the same kind of land uses, large agricultural areas, it has urban areas, it has residential areas, and essentially the same kind of activities that we have here. Its population is a little bigger, as you can see from the chart. And when we look at their cost of running their municipality is $530 per capita. We're paying $880. And Dr. Bish, I would ask you to try to explain why the great difference.
First of all,
I'll leave him to it.
No. First of all, this is about the governments. You have nothing here about the actual production of services and who's responsible for the services. What's done by the Greater Victoria Parks rather than Surrey? What's done by the Greater Victoria Water District, the Greater Victoria Sewer District? You cannot compare the Blue Book costs, the municipal statistics, and draw conclusions until you know what activities they're responsible for. That's why the new table has taken all of the expenditures in the region and broken them down by who's responsible. Surrey is an interesting case because they brought in Doug Lychuk as their city manager, who was an incredibly powerful city manager for shortening the time to process permits, contracting out services, totally modern guy that was incredible. And he made Surrey efficient. We haven't had anybody quite like Doug Lychuk in any municipality in Victoria, although Metchosin's pretty small, the first city manager there was incredible, and that's why Metchosin is so inexpensive. And Langford was very good. Our old traditional cities like Victoria pretty much do things the way they've always done them. So we know why differences occur, but these numbers, we've learned that you can't use the reported numbers in BC statistics to tell you anything about who's producing the services. So when we look at the fact that the Western communities, municipalities are a little bigger than they might be some elsewhere, well then we realize their recreation through the West Shore Parks and Recreation comes from the municipal budget. But up on the peninsula, the Panorama Leisure Center doesn't come from the municipal budget, it comes from the CRD budget. And the Vancouver Island Regional Library, for those cities in the regional library, they don't come from the municipal budget, they come from the tax roll separate from the municipal budget. But if you're in the Greater Victoria Library Association, it comes out of your municipal budget. And you've got to go behind these numbers and get into how production is occurring. And then you can begin to sort out where you think things are relatively more expensive And some things we understand. We understand why Souk spends less. Souk spends less because the regional district spends more. They left a lot of their things with the regional district to go joint with the adjacent electoral area. So you've got to get into the production. And the problem in the academic world, the number of political scientists who study local government that care about production is just about zero. I don't know how we count Jim. Jim's a political scientist, but his dissertation advisor got the Nobel Prize in economics. Okay? So we sort of count him across the bridge. There's very few economists understand the production structure that underlie local government services. We understand there's a lot of, it's not bad research. One thing about working in Canada that's a little bit frustrating sometimes is there's not a lot of social science research money compared to when we're down in the US. But you know, when we started the Local Government Institute, we got a foundation to give us nearly $1 million to study this kind of stuff, because they think it's important. We got turned down by, what is it, the government-funded research. They weren't interested in this. When the first time we asked to study private versus public collection of garbage, we got responses back, no municipality would ever do this in Canada. It's all public. So we borrowed a little money from somewhere else. Jim McDavid did the study, and we had almost a 50% difference between private collection and public collection. That difference doesn't exist anymore. Once you began to get the information out, the public improved. But as long as nobody was paying attention to them, they didn't. That's why. I mean, I used these statistics in 1999 because I was kind of lazy using up some funding, and we knew that Surrey was different, but you can't. But Surrey's an outlier. There's nobody else looks like Surrey in the province of that scale. And Surrey, you know, when Doug Lychuk came in, he had people like me come over and give lectures to the city council on the role of the city council, which from his point of view was leave him alone. Were you around when he was there?
Right.
Yeah, and of course, he wasn't very popular with the employees, and I think when his house caught fire, the firemen didn't want to go put it out. But I mean, Surrey is a really, in terms of public services, Surrey is very good. They do not put the money into the neighborhood efforts that cities like Victoria do. You know, Victoria gives a budget to all those community organizations. They cost more, but it reinforces the nature of the community in a way that's very valuable that Surrey just doesn't have.
Jonny, did you want to comment on this? Yes, they're not your figures, but...
Well, briefly, I mean, Bob's right, you've got to compare what is the service level with the costs. And I did work in Surrey before Mr. Lychuk went there. I knew Doug, in fact I helped teach Doug. I wish I hadn't. I think Doug worked in Surrey, Edmonton, and Mississauga. And when his house burnt down, the running joke was, well, we've narrowed it down, the suspects, to anybody who worked in but I'm not sure whether these numbers include regional costs that have been allocated as well, because...
No, I took out the schools and...
No, I'm talking about the
schools.
GBRD versus CRD. Are these costs...
No, those costs are the costs that the municipality collects each year to deal with municipal services.
Just their own. So obviously there's a difference there between what is done at the regional level and what is done at the local level. But I'm sorry about that answer, actually, because it screwed up my obvious thing. You look at the regional difference in regional cost and the explanation.
We
who was running the region for the 15 years.
We may need to leave the details of this to another moment, because there's other people who would like to ask questions, and I'd like to go to the back, because there's about 5 people who
yeah, we've got the new data, but it'll come out in January in a monograph. We've gone through all of the services here to sort that kind of stuff out, and I got a table in front of me that gives me all that kind of information.
At the back, yes, please.
A friend who told me and said that provincial government wants amalgamation because when you have a central body, it's easier to hijack.
talked a lot about economics, but it seems to me that Victoria, it's pretty well all the business tax money, you mentioned that, right? They get, everyone sort of goes their party, so they get all that money to get the events money. They get a lot of development, and they're in pretty much deep financial trouble. So they can't make it. We've got property taxes in most municipalities, and we have better services. But the other point I wanted to make was that, could you maybe talk about priorities and policy? Like, that seems to be what happens, that gets taken over with the central body, and they become the main activities rather than services to the, you know, the various regional municipalities. And I think that's an important factor. We seem to be talking a lot about economics, but they're just equally as important.
I just think there's a tendency to standardize. You look at Winnipeg, which did the 2 tiers in what, 1970s? And they started out with the neighborhood governments and the upper tier, and the neighborhood governments basically lost their influence. Because when you get the central agency doing the budgeting and the central agency controlling the personnel, there's a tendency to want to sort of smooth things out. And it's just harder to maintain that diversity. I mean, for you that live here, you know, you can go live near the Sydney waterfront, or you can go to Metchosin and, you know, be a gentleman farmer. The choice here for residential locations is absolutely incredible. Very unusual. And it's reinforcing. New people aren't moving into Metchosin to make it look like Sydney. They're moving into Metchosin because they like it. So,
if I could, I mean, it comes back to what kind of policy decision, not just activity, but what kind of policy decision should be made at a regional level or just a local level. And there are a lot of policies that should be just made at a local level because of the reasons Bob says. It provides diversity, and if you don't like this village, then move to another one that has a set of policies you do like. But there are certain policies that make no sense to be made on a local basis. Air quality. The air doesn't stay still. So to have, you know, kind of 10 municipalities with burning bans and one not makes no sense at all. No sense at all. And so there's a lot of things like that, and that's what you got to sort out. You got to sort out which are the policies that need to be made at a larger level and which need to be made at a local level. But to do that, I think if you try and do that within an amalgamated government framework, I think Bob's right. There's a tendency to standardize it all.
Don't we have that now?
What?
Don't we have those decisions? A lot of those decisions are made centrally and a lot are made locally.
Yeah, we have a 2-tier system, and I agree with the 2-tier system. I think the 2-tier system is really good. And I think the local governments operate superbly within their spheres of influence. What doesn't work as well is the upper tier, because you have those conflicts of interest, and so they shy away from certain decisions that they have to make that might be tough. And that's what we've got to address.
they make the decisions that are mutually beneficial,
Yeah.
especially when there's economies of scale like Panorama and so on. But they don't make the hard decisions where somebody's going to be a loser.
Down there? Yeah.
Liz, thank you very much. I'm Celia Stock, a counselor, and my other counselor colleagues are up there. We all came, we're very interested in this discussion because I want to know what happens. My experience hasn't been good when I lived in Ottawa and Montreal with what happens to the small, more rural communities like North Saanich, like Metchosin, like Highlands, like Central Saanich, and even parts of Saanich when they get amalgamated with larger areas where it's more urban. And so, you know, and there are times where we only have 12,000 people and Central Saanich has 15 or 16,000. And so, you know, I wondered what your experience or what from your studies and I think what happens is we get left out.
Well, you'll have groups in your community that say, you know, you really don't have a program for the arts, and there's not very many of us, but the There's one in the central part of it, so we want one too. And so gradually you will have the most vocal first, bringing in programs that you've not decided to do. And there'll be Halifax, when they first started, had 60 different taxing areas. Indianapolis had 100 when they managed, because you're trying to get people to pay for what they get. So we already have a system where you pay for what you get. And when you join up with the Panorama Leisure Center, those 3 municipalities pay for what they get. And we don't, if you're in Metchosin, you don't get to pay for Panorama Leisure Center. It's too far away. So the bigger cities, but as our experience, rural Halifax is a good example. They raised their taxes 30% in the rural area and begin to add urban type services. So I wouldn't know that they're left out, but they're providing them with services that they certainly didn't want to pay for before, but now they'll get to pay for them because the decision is being made by the bigger board. You have to remember, a lot of amalgamations aren't made for the reasons we're discussing here. Indianapolis is a good example. They had a Republican House, a Republican Senate, a Republican governor, and they were always electing a Democratic mayor in Indianapolis. So by adding the suburbs, they could elect a Republican mayor in Indianapolis. And they were smart. They didn't affect the production. They kept the county sheriff in the county areas. They didn't interfere with the small municipalities. And so all they did was merge the county council and the city council so they could have a Republican mayor. You got to be careful about amalgamations as well, because you got to go look the money. More than 95% of the money is in the production of services. You've got to look at the production of services, and then you got to look at these hard questions, because air quality isn't real expensive, but you got to do it at a larger scale. And so we've not been able to move beyond the voluntary nature of the regional district, and there are certain issues that you need to do that.
Johnny, did you have?
No, that's fine. Well, let's get to the next question.
At the very back.
Murray Weisberger, and I'm a bit of a disciple of Mr. Carline's. I've met him in Surrey many times when I was very active there. And one of the problems I have, I sort of am in favor of Central Saanich, North Saanich and Sydney at least working together over time to maybe accomplish what we're talking about, except form of amalgamation. But going back to Surrey, we have the pretend land because what happens when you have individual land use decisions made in one municipality that profoundly affect the infrastructure needs of the greater regions by their land use decisions. And that's certainly what's happened in Surrey, where I know in Surrey they decided that the livable region strategic plan wasn't for them and they just ignored it. I often thought if Mr. Carline would have been made king, we would have had a much better situation in the Lower Mainland. By the way, I talked to Bob Bowes today, and he sends his greetings to you.
Yeah.
So how do you control those land use decisions in the
It's one of the extremely hard questions, and when regional districts created, they had regional planning authority. And one of the issues here was they proposed the Tillicum Mall literally be twice as big as it is now. It fit the regional plan okay, but then the western communities in Victoria didn't like that much retailing going into Saanich, and they cut it off and shrunk it. And it was one of several fights over tax base where the province simply removed the regional planning authority of the regional districts. You guys got it back sooner than anybody else, didn't you?
Well, not exactly.
And we have the strategic planning, but it was one of the ones where the province opted for the preferences of the municipalities over the region. UBCM wasn't yet very influenced by regional districts. It's influenced by municipalities.
Actually, from a Vancouver perspective, we had a different take on the loss of regional planning authority. There was a case in Metro Vancouver where a guy had bought a lot of farmland, wanted to redevelop as residential, actually persuaded the local council to do that. And under the then planning legislation, where the regional planning had authority, it was in agricultural designation. It was actually in the ALR. And so for the first time, even though the region had been very, very tactful in the application of their regional plan, they decided this was a case where they had to draw the line and say no. And the developer and the municipality in question had connections in the province. The province was sympathetic. And as we said, the relevant minister reacted very kind of responsibly, just stamped his foot and took away planning authority right across the province. And so it went. And when it was reintroduced, and I have to preface this with Mike Harcourt is a real good friend of mine, but Mike Harcourt was the premier, and he had been involved in the Livable Region Strategic Plan, and he really bought in to the consensus-based way that the Livable Region Strategic Plan had been developed, and he never accepted that in fact it didn't work, that in fact it just allowed people to do whatever they wanted, like the person said, Surrey, just ignored it. So it was Mike and Darlene Mazzari who introduces the new legislation that really kind of said, yeah, you can do planning again, but essentially to get a plan through, you've got to get unanimous consent of the municipalities. And I mean, hell, even a jury can have one dissenter, but I mean, and when I got the new regional growth strategy through for Metro Vancouver in 2011, 21 municipalities, and the last one hung out, and we had to get a mediator and so on. And you say in the end, I got 21 municipalities to agree. Yeah, it was consensus by definition, but no one looked at me as a consensus builder because you used every trick in the book. You used, you cuddled up sometimes and you threatened sometimes and you talked and you went to the public and you did everything you could to get that over the finishing line. And the current legislation is just so hard. But I do think the question was, what do you do with a land use where a local municipality is doing something that affects everybody else? That's the purpose of a regional strategic plan, is to go in there and say, here's the strategic plan, and it's got to be detailed enough not to allow that to happen, which means it's got to have some strength that says, okay, if you're designated low density residential and all of a sudden you want to go high density commercial or something, you can't do it without the region's consent. And at the moment, with the current legislation, people tend to pass regional growth strategies. I won't comment on Greater Victoria's, I don't know it. It'd be an insult for me to do it. But the Livable Region Strategic Plan was a Tinkerbell consensus one. It had all the principles, but you could ignore it without pain. The new one has now got real legal consequences, that if you ignore it, we take you to court.
Well, that leaves me in a dilemma. I was going to ask a question normally, but quickly I'll make it a general question. And the regional growth strategy says that we are to make make efficient use of public facilities, services, land, and other resources. That's the regional growth strategy. We've agreed to that. Everyone has signed on here. The official community plan says that the official community plan should work towards those objects. Now there is an area which is far away from that center, which is equal to the size of, say, the city of Victoria, no population, no services, no roads, no nothing. And that's being chopped up into 4-hectare lots, spread out over 17 kilometers. So the question is, how do you test whether or not that suggestion in the official community plan meets the regional growth strategy? So it's an abstract question. Since we don't want to deal with particulars, I can get very particular.
Ray and I dealt with it for a long time, and it's a stupid development pattern.
This is
horrible.
This is one of the really difficult questions, because if you have a regional growth strategy that is too detailed, it just becomes like another zoning document. And that isn't what you want a regional plan to do. But if the regional plan is just a set of principles, then violating those principles is very hard to challenge and enforce, including the courts of law. And I'll use a different example to prove the point. The province included in the Municipal Act, the Charter, that it would consult and take into consideration municipal points of view and would not act without municipality input. And that was written into the law. They then did something without consultation that totally ignored us, and we took them to court. And the judge said, those are just, when people make those principal statements, those are just general statements of intent. And they cannot require a government to live up to them in every single case. Case dismissed. And I think if you challenged a regional plan on the basis that the municipality had violated the principles, you're probably going to have about the same level of success. Unless there's a designation on a map that says that's damned agricultural or low density or whatever it is, and it's going to stay that way, then it's very hard to make general statements of principles applicable in a court dispute, applicable to specific decisions. So to make a regional growth strategy effective, it has to have a certain level of detail, and it has to have a map with a designation that means something and can't be interpreted any which way you want.
And let me add, that may not even work, because on Cortez Island, which is up off Campbell River, we had to sue the government for approving a subdivision contrary to the plan. We won in court, both local and appeals. And then we got an order in council from the cabinet to overturn the decision.
There's a question down here, and this, I think, may be our last question.
Dr. Bish, there was a recent study put out by one of the institutes with respect to small city amalgamations. I spoke to you about it before. Was that reasonably well done? It was it spoke against small city amalgamations.
Is that the one that the Fraser people put out from the? It was okay in the sense I was. You know, it was done by good people, but it was a little bit casual compared to what I would have preferred. They had small cities pose some really interesting questions. Like Highlands is small. You know, Highlands also has got a 6 councillors and a mayor. Okay, they're not too expensive because they don't do anything, but the council's really expensive. There are across North America a lot of very small communities that would make significant cost savings from some kind of joint relationships on production, be it amalgamation or county or however you want to do it. Often they choose not to. And my attitude is if they're paying for it, I don't worry about them. Like I don't worry about Highlands, okay? They can have 6 members on their council. Costs them, what, $20 per capita for their council instead of $5 per capita. I don't know, because they're left over. You got little towns out in the prairies that used to be a market center that now that people have cars and trucks and drive further and the farms are bigger, they're just sort of disappearing. I remember when I came to BC, the smallest municipality had 3 people. And so we did close down gold rush towns and so on, but I'm an advocate of the local people having legislation that allows them to seek solutions that make sense and pretty much accept their opinions.
Are you doing any studies now?
We're doing a monograph on the Capital Region.
Right.
It's not going to be as careful and as documented as the C.D. Howe in 2001. I retired in 1998. I don't have quite as much energy anymore. but it's not going to solve all the problems. It leads exactly to the problem Jonny has as one of the key issues. And it leads to recommending a fiscal study on Victoria. And it leads to considering things like the arterial highways, because if you can control your highways, your water, your sewer, and your public transit, you've gone a long way toward your land use issue if you have a subdivision bylaw that doesn't let you subdivide unless you have access to certain infrastructure. So there's a way to get, we've got American cities that have no zoning. All of their control is through access to infrastructure. And it works, okay? It works. Kind of unique to Canadian, but it works. It gives the developers a lot of opportunities, but you got to be near that sewer. You got to be near that water line. You got to be near that transportation, you know. And so it's a performance-related way of doing it, and that's common in Texas. If you like economic development, go to Texas. It's booming, okay? There's nothing particularly odd about their cities, except the last time I was there, I was in this big fancy hotel, and down in the yard in front of the hotel's a single-family home, because the couple that sold the land for the hotel didn't want to leave their home until they died, so it was still there. Okay. There's no zoning. It's okay.
Jonny, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, just on the amalgamation, I won't get into the zoning question, we'll be here all night, but on the amalgamation of smaller communities, number one, at one level, the higher level of government usually doesn't want to see amalgamations below it. I don't think the province wants to see amalgamation of big cities, because then that big city becomes a bigger political rival and threat and challenge to the province. If they're driven towards amalgamation, it's usually because there's a business interest behind them. Similarly, I don't think regional governments like amalgamations of their component cities. I was talking to the regional manager of Johannesburg, and the biggest problems he had was the amalgamation of some municipalities that just fought the region tooth and nail, and if they had enough powerful clout in their municipality, it was difficult to deal with. And in my experience, and I've said this openly, so it's no problem, my biggest issue in running Metro Vancouver was always the City of Vancouver. Always, and they had progressive governments and progressive city managers, but they wanted to do things their way. It took me over 10 years to get them to agree to have a regional emergency planning strategy. I mean, you know, drop dead, absolutely obvious thing to do. City of Vancouver fought it for a dozen years. So the bigger cities are a problem, not the little cities. So I wouldn't go for amalgamating little cities. And my experience in going, you can imagine what, culture shock. I went from Metro Vancouver, running a $500 million budget, to Metchosin. And I went to the first election where somebody said, are you prepared to consider debt? And every candidate said, no, never, we'd never go 2 cents in debt, ever. And what's the difference? If you want anything done in Metchosin, it's a volunteer organization that does it. So if I want to get active, I don't go to the municipality, I go to the Metchosin Community Association, and we get things done that way. And it's a different culture. It's a different culture. And you get to choose. I'm with Bob. You get to choose the kind of community you want. And if you want a community that has big city services, don't go to the little places that rely on volunteer things. It's a different thing. Anyway, that's
right. Yeah. Ray, I think you had a question.